and welcome to Western Civ, episode 226, After Constantinople. When we last talked about the Ottoman Empire, the date was roughly May the 29th, 1453. Constantinople, that bulwark of Orthodox Christianity, the city of Constantine the Great, whose Theodosian walls had withstood so many assaults, was finally in Muslim hands. In terms of Western Europe, in this show, we're roughly 100 years further along in our timeline. Needless to say, a lot has happened in the 100 years between in the East. Between 1453 and the early 1520s, the Ottoman Empire will become the preeminent military power in Europe. More than France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, or England, the Ottoman Empire was able to dictate affairs to other nations thanks, largely, in part, I suppose, to their effective and early adoption of artillery. Today, we wheel east to catch ourselves up. Two days after Constantinople fell, the Genoese colony of Galata across the Golden Horn surrendered. The Genoese hoped to maintain the same kind of independence they had enjoyed under the Byzantines. At first, Mehmet told them that they could, but then he changed his mind. The citizens of Galata became Ottoman subjects. That left them relatively free compared to much of Western Europe. But as Christians, they were still subject to the poll tax called the jizya. A reminder, Muslim rulers allowed non-Muslim peoples of the book, so Jews and Christians, to reside in their territories and practice their religions so long as they paid this tax. Alongside the new name of the city, Istanbul, the now capital of the Ottoman Empire remained Constantinople and would for centuries throughout much of Europe. Istanbul itself is thought to have been derived from the Greek is tin polin, which translates to literally in the city or to the city. Thus, Istanbul likely, at first, was nothing more than a geographic distinction, an indication as to who lived within the walls. To Mehmet and the Ottomans, the capture of Constantinople, which from this point forward I will generally refer to as Istanbul for ease of use, was the culmination of nearly 800 years of military expansion. It was the ultimate glory. It opened up Eastern Europe to conquest. For centuries, Constantinople had functioned like a stopper on a bottle. It was too difficult to move troops from Anatolia and beyond into Eastern Europe, with a major city on the Bosphorus in Christian hands. Now, with Istanbul under his control, Mehmet could consider further expansion west. But Istanbul was also a huge city and needed to be resupplied constantly, as it did not produce the necessary foodstuffs on its own to come anywhere close to feeding itself. Hence, before he could think about expanding west, Mehmet needed the resources of the Black Sea to feed his new capital. Now, before we move off the conquest of Constantinople/Istanbul, we need to remember in the West, the news hit like a thunderclap. Western Europeans were shocked and dismayed. The Pope called for an immediate crusade. With hindsight, we know that Western Europe will never again rouse itself to a great crusade. But in 1453, Mehmet did not know that. His policies, post-conquest of Constantinople, would need to balance his desire for expansion against a need not to inflame the West to the extent that they might consider launching a crusade. For the Genoese and Venetians, whose livelihoods depended on trade through the Black Sea, the outlook was bleak. Neither state, on its own, had the ability to resist Mehmet and his guns. Later, in 1453, Mehmet sent a squadron of 56 ships to the Black Sea to, quote, show the flag, announcing his intentions to conquer the region. The Venetians decided that their best bet was to cut a deal, so they did. In 1453, the Venetians signed a peace treaty with Mehmet that also allowed them to continue their maritime activities in and around Istanbul in exchange for the payment of significant customs duties. Genoese were either not so smart or not so lucky. The Ottomans allied with the local remnants of the Mongols, the Tartars, on the Crimea. The Tartars, as an aside, would rule the Crimea until its conquest by the Russian Empire in the 18th century. The Tartars of Crimea are distinct from the Golden Horde. In the early 15th century, they asserted their independence from their former overlords, though they would quickly become dependent on the Ottomans. However, despite all this Black Sea stuff, in the first decade after the capture of Istanbul, Mehmet focused almost entirely on the Balkans. His first campaign in 1453, after the fall of the city, was against Serbia. Serbia was an independent kingdom at the time, and the buffer between the Ottomans and the Hungarian kingdom to the north. Serbia was also the only means by which Hungarian influence could penetrate the Ottoman Empire. The total conquest of Serbia took 5 years. Mehmet took a few castles along the route to Belgrade in 1554, but nothing of significance. In 1555, Mehmet captured the crucial silver-producing region of Novgorod. Its capture was important because by exploiting Novgorod, Mehmet could essentially get Serbia to pay for its own conquest. The next year, 1456, only 3 years after the fall of Istanbul, Mehmet stood before the walls of Belgrade. Belgrade, which sits at the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, was and is the key to entering Hungary. There, Mehmet finally lost. The city itself was a fortress and presented nearly as many challenges to the conqueror as had Istanbul. In fact, the city was so well defended that it actually remained in Hungarian hands until 1522. Staying in the Balkans for a moment, because I think it's easier to think about all this one theater at a time. In 1456, Mehmet got a big break when John Hyundai died of the plague. Hyundai had been a capable monarch and frustrated Mehmet's efforts to complete the conquest of Serbia. It was not until 1458 that Hyundai's son, Michael Corvinus, succeeded him to the throne. Then, in 1456, the king of Serbia died, leading to a power vacuum Mehmet hoped to exploit. Now, technically, Serbia had been an Ottoman vassal state since the 14th century. However, now Mehmet was determined to add Serbia to his empire as a province. And this is going to be kind of a theme of the rest of Mehmet's reign. The time was right. Many in Serbia preferred living under the more laissez-faire Ottomans as opposed to the ardent Hungarian Catholics. The leader of the pro-Ottoman faction in Serbia was Michael Anglevic, the brother of one of Mehmet's key advisors, Mahmud Pasha. In 1458, Michael invited the Ottomans to intervene. Mehmet didn't wait for the excuse to lapse, and Mahmud Pasha led an army in person and shortly thereafter stood before the crucial fortress of Smederev. By the time Pasha arrived, the pro-Hungarian faction had packed off Michael Anglevic to Hungary and were prepared to defend the fortress. Pasha stormed it anyway, taking the fortress but not the inner citadel. He also captured a few strategic points along the Danube. Finally, in 1459, the pro-Ottoman faction took control of the citadel and handed the keys over to Mehmet. Thus, after 1459, Serbia is, for all practical purposes, an Ottoman province. In 1562, there was trouble in the Ottoman vassal state of Wallachia. Wallachia no longer exists, but at the time it was a fairly large kingdom, stretching from the north of the river Danube to just south of the Carpathian Mountains. The trouble was that in 1561, Wallachia had failed to pay the expected tribute. This is because the current king, Vlad Dracul, the Impaler, deliberately withheld it. Now, if that name sounds familiar, yes, Vlad Dracul was Bram Stoker's inspiration for Count Dracula in his novel of the same name. Mehmet dispatched Mahmud Pasha with an army to force Wallachia back into line. Vlad Dracul was deposed, and his more amenable brother placed on the throne. No word on whether or not he turned into a bat and fled. The only way that the Ottoman flank could be secured from Hungarian incursions would be if the Ottomans secured the entire Danube-Sava river line. These two rivers bisect the Balkans, from the Black Sea to the east to the Adriatic in the west. The Ottomans already had control over most of Serbia. Then in 1463, the other Ottoman vassal in the region, Bosnia, refused to send its tribute. Mehmet did a little fist pump and a dance, and then dispatched Mahmud Pasha with yet another army. By the close of 1463, the Kingdom of Bosnia, like Serbia, was no longer an Ottoman vassal. Now, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, a province. While all this was going on, the Ottomans were steadily working to conquer the Genoese maritime empire in the Aegean. In 1455, Mehmet seized a number of Genoese colonies in the region, including the ancient city of Athens. Athens did not have any military or economic significance at this point, but as the birthplace of democracy and the cradle of Western civilization, its prestige value to the educated Mehmet could not be overstated. Likewise, in 1462, the island of Lesbos surrendered. Meanwhile, Mehmet was always continuing efforts to fortify the Dardanelles, which was quickly becoming the lifeline between the Black Sea region and the quickly growing Ottoman Empire to the south. At this point, it's worth pausing and remembering that while we might not consider the Black Sea important today, they certainly did in the 15th and 16th centuries. Columbus had not yet reached the Americas in the 1450s. He would not for another 40 years. So the trade coming from China went overland, and generally, it flowed through the ports in the Black Sea. Plus, the region, which is today part of Ukraine, was a major producer of grain, as the region is now, necessary to feed all those islands, and, of course, Istanbul itself, which was nothing more than a parasite on the empire. Even after the loss of Constantinople itself, the Byzantine Empire continued to limp on through the existence of several pointless and powerless rump states. Slowly but surely, Mehmet swallowed these up. The kingdom of Trebizond became a vassal state in 1456. In 1458, the despotate of Morea failed to pay its tribute, so Mehmet crossed the Isthmus of Corinth, and before the year was out, all of the Peloponnese was in Ottoman control. The exiled despot of said despotate made one half-hearted effort to reclaim his kingdom in 1460, but Mehmet brushed him aside like a troublesome gnat. Now to the east, Mehmet faced a much more difficult foe, the Shah of Shiite Iran. The Shah sent messages to the Sultan in 1460, indicating that the kingdom of Trebizond was in eastern Anatolia, and therefore his. Mehmet disagreed. He went forward with the process of annexing the kingdom as a formal province, rather than a vassal state, in 1461. The Shah sent troops to hinder his progress, but at least for now, there was no major confrontation. Mehmet decided to lead the campaign to annex Trebizond himself. The locals were hostile to his advance over the mountain range between the coast and Trebizond itself, on the Anatolian plateau much further inland. But Mehmet remained determined. One story illustrates this. A camel laden with gold coins fell on the pass down to the capital of Trebizond, scattering the treasure everywhere. Mehmet gave the order that whoever could pick up a coin could keep it. Here is what happened. Quote, "Before we came down from that mountain, we had plenty of trouble. The earth was as sticky as porridge, and the Janissaries had to carry the emperor, i.e. the Sultan, in their arms all the way down to the plain, and treasure camels reached in the mountains. Emperor Mehmet begged the Janissaries to make an effort to get the camels down to the plain, and we had to go back up the mountain with great effort and struggle all night before we got them down. The emperor stayed there that day resting, and gave the Janissaries 50,000 gold pieces, those that had spilled, to divide amongst themselves, and he raised the wages of the Janissary centurions." End quote. The city of Trebizond surrendered after a siege of 6 weeks. Under Islamic law, if a city surrendered, its inhabitants were allowed to go free. The treasurer of the kingdom, who happened to be cousins with Mahmud Pasha, negotiated the city's surrender, and hence all the inhabitants were allowed to go free, including the quote-unquote emperor of Trebizond and his family, except his daughter, oddly, Anna, who entered the sultan's harem and wound up being executed 2 years later. With the conquest of Trebizond, Mehmet had now consolidated all the territories which had formerly been under Byzantine rule. In fact, he now ruled all the Byzantine territory that had existed before the time of the Fourth Crusade in 1204. As Mehmet's gaze fell more and more on the Mediterranean, it became increasingly crucial for the Ottomans to control the sea. That meant that they had to deal with Venice. The Venetians were still very much a strong naval power at the time. In fact, they might have been the strongest naval power in the Mediterranean. In 1463, the truce between the Ottomans and the Venetians came to an end. As a result, the Ottomans immediately attacked Venetian territory around, I'm going to struggle with this, Nafpaktus. Today it's known as Lepanto. And in July of that year, the Venetian Senate declared war on the Sultan. At first, this initial war between Venice and the Ottomans went very well for the Venetians. Much of the Peloponnese again came under Venetian control. Then, in the early autumn, King Matthias of Hungary crossed the Danube and opened up another front. Sensing a real opportunity for the first time since the fall of Constantinople, the Pope made a 3-year truce with the Duke of Burgundy, who agreed to go on crusade against the Ottomans. But just like every other crusading deal from this point forward, it wasn't worth the paper it was written on. The alliance crumbled in only 6 months. The real setback in 1564 for the Venetians was their failure to retake Lesbos. But this was a minor setback, and I don't think anyone could have blamed Venice for rejecting the Ottoman peace overtures of that year. Venice remained a big problem for Mehmet. Remember, this is not the age of Napoleon with its massive sprawling armies. Armies were still paid, professional, and rather small. For navies, this was even more true. So a rich but tiny power like Venice could still absolutely punch above its weight class. Moreover, Venice could lend support to those kingdoms in the Balkans who still held out. Albania, for example, an Ottoman vassal, immediately renounced its allegiance in 1563 when war between the Ottomans and Venetians appeared imminent. It offered its allegiance to Venice, which gladly accepted. Mehmet reacted decisively. In the summer of 1466, and in only 25 days, he built an enormous fortress across the ancient Via Egnatia, effectively severing the communication and supply links between the King of Albania and the Venetians on the coast. Between 1466 and 1468, Mehmet slowly but steadily brought most of Hungary under his control, albeit a tenuous one. The Albanian king fled to Venice in 1468 and died in exile. However, Ottoman control over mountainous Albania remained patchy at best and would throughout the balance of Mehmet's reign. Although from the European perspective, Mehmet is generally only thought about as the architect of the Ottoman push into Europe, he actually spent much of his reign defending his eastern frontier. I already mentioned his conquest of Trebizond in 1460. His main rival to the east was Uzan Hasan, the Shah of Iran. Venice recognized value in supporting Hasan and agreed to an alliance in 1463, under which Hasan was allowed to keep any of the lands that he conquered in Anatolia. By the mid-15th century, relations between the Ottomans and Hasan had devolved so much that war was inevitable. He jumped at the chance to intervene in Ottoman vassal states to the east, while Mehmet was tied up in the west. By 1467, Hasan had gobbled up massive swaths of territory at Mehmet's expense. Immediately, this made Hasan a much more dangerous rival than he had hitherto been. Simultaneously, Hassan reached out to the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt. At this point, the Mamluks controlled very little beyond Syria and were not the dominant power they had once been. Hassan offered him an alliance against the Ottomans, while proclaiming at the same time to be the sole legitimate Islamic sovereign to the north. This was a big deal. Mehmet, since the conquest of Istanbul, had tried to portray himself as the rightful heir to the Islamic world. In the 8th century, the Caliphate controlled everything from Iran across North Africa into Spain. Those were the glory days. Mehmet wanted them back, but with him at the helm. Mehmet remained obsessed with men like Alexander the Great. He wanted to do what the most famous military leader in history had done, but the opposite. Mehmet wanted to march west. But he couldn't do that while Hassan continued his psychological warfare. Hassan was competing with Mehmet on a spiritual level, as well as a temporal one. In a letter that he sent to the Sultan in 1471, Hassan claimed to represent the quote-unquote throne of the Caliphate. Hassan also tried to appeal to the tribal peoples of Anatolia by criticizing Ottoman policy. Mehmet had been collecting the poll tax from the tribesmen in the region, which was only supposed to have been collected from non-Muslims. Moreover, the Ottomans had a policy of sedentarization, getting the tribal peoples of Anatolia to drop their nomadic ways and settle down. They resented this policy, and Hassan sought to play off their resentment by arguing that the Quran called for the opposite. Any true leader of the Muslim world would see that. Any true leader of the Muslim world would know that Mehmet was not a leader of the faith. Hassan was. In 1471, Mehmet decided he would focus more on the kingdom to the east. That year, he sent an army to subdue the kingdom of Karaman, located in the southeastern part of Anatolia. This conquest was back and forth more than anything else. The Ottomans captured a few Karaman strongholds, but while they did this, the Venetians came around their flank and burned several port cities in the region and close to the Dardanelles. Then, in 1472, Hassan announced his intention to intervene in what remained of Karaman. This incursion briefly caused the Ottomans and Mamluks to unite against him. The Mamluks' only goal here was to try to keep a balance of power in the Near East and therefore protect their independence. But as a result of the campaign, Hassan briefly obtained control over the Taurus passes to the Mediterranean. Hassan also continued to ally himself with the Venetians, which certainly gave Mehmet pause. It's interesting to think sometimes how the lack of centralization actually makes it more difficult to conquer one's enemies. When you're dealing with empire versus empire, one conquers the other or takes land from the other, and that's the end of it. But when there are tons of little states, tribes, and a few larger, more centralized states in play, this is a lot harder, especially if all these smaller states ally against you. Just when you crush one, another sacks a city somewhere, takes territory, or burns down a port. Moreover, if these territories constantly rebel, you can never be sure that the territory you just took will stay loyal. I can see why Mehmet must have been frustrated. Regardless, Hassan's incursion in 1472 led Mehmet to think that the time was right for a full-scale military operation against him. The two met at the Euphrates on August 4, 1473, and fought an inconclusive battle that resulted in both sides taking heavy losses. A week later, the armies met again in the mountains to the north. This time, the Ottoman advantage in artillery showed. Frankly, for 25 years, the Ottoman understanding and use of gunpowder gave them a distinct advantage over their opponents. Hassan fled the battlefield, and his army was crushed. Still, Hassan lost very little territory as a result of this defeat, because Mehmet was not able to follow up on his victory. In terms of terrain, you see, eastern Anatolia and beyond was a lot like the Balkans, mountainous territory that made conducting full-scale military operations difficult. As a result, Ottoman commanders tended to fall back to more defensible borders. Even though Mehmet did conquer more territory, Hassan still lost more land. But this was the result of internal rebellion rather than a direct consequence of Mehmet. As Hassan moved to deal with said internal revolt, Mehmet was finally free to annex Karaman, which he did in 1474. The Sultan was also very interested in his navy. From the earliest times, Ottoman sultans had used the sea as a major line of defense. The Ottomans built dockyards when they first gained a coastline on the Sea of Marmara. Once they crossed into Thrace, they needed ships to defend themselves against the Venetians, and over time that need would only grow. As the Ottomans advanced further and further into Greece, Mehmet built a new dockyard along the Aegean coast, with the goal of competing with the Venetians and the Genoese. However, all this paled in comparison with what Mehmet did in Istanbul. Not long after the conquest of the city, the Sultan built a massive new dockyard in the Golden Horn. This new dockyard had a very specific purpose. While the Ottomans had done a better job of competing against the Venetian galleys, larger caravels proved more difficult. The Ottomans simply could not hold their own in the 1450s against the established maritime powers, because they could not build ships big enough to punch at their weight class. The new balance of power in the Mediterranean would be one with versatility. Mehmet needed to upgrade his navy to continue his expansion. In 1475, a new navy with larger ships sailed out from Istanbul and took Kaffa, as well as a few lesser Genoese holdings. For the first time, the southern portions of the Crimea became an Ottoman province. In 1478, the Tartars accepted Ottoman overlordship over the remainder of the peninsula. These sorts of annexations, by the way, were starting to follow a familiar pattern, familiar to both the Ottomans and you, listeners of this show. A succession crisis would cause one side or the other to ask the Ottomans to intervene. And when the dust settled, their kingdom was now Mehmet's kingdom, sometimes a vassal state, sometimes an outright province. Rinse and repeat. Following the conquest of Constantinople, the Ottomans were the undisputed power in the Black Sea. Mostly this is just because they held the Dardanelles. The Ottomans weren't stupid. They refused to be sucked into a pointless effort to conquer the steppe lands to the north of the sea. So long as they held the ports, that was enough. After the Ottomans took the Crimea, it was easy for Mehmet to play the smaller kingdoms and territories off one another to their detriment and to the Ottomans' advantage. Really, until the rise of Russia in the 17th century, Ottoman power in this region would grow unchecked. As Mehmet gradually achieved his strategic aims in the west, Ottoman territory increasingly formed a compact bloc, with only a few isolated fortresses in enemy hands. In other words, the patchwork that had been the Eastern Mediterranean since the decline of the Byzantine Empire since 1204 was coming to a close. Until the late 19th century, and in some parts right up to World War I, the Ottomans will be the force in the region. In 1478, Uzan Hasan died. His death removed the eastern threat to the Ottomans for the moment. This then forced the Venetians to sue for peace in 1479. At peace at sea, Mehmet turned his attention toward what was then Transylvania, and what would later be southern Austria. While these were little more than raids at this point, at any given moment the Ottomans were capable of sending 50,000 men into the region. But with Venice and Iran temporarily out of the picture, Mehmet's most ambitious project involved actions taken against the island of Rhodes, held by the Knights Hospitaller, and against the Kingdom of Naples at Otranto on the Italian mainland. Both campaigns went forward in 1480, clearly illustrating the change in logistical power that the Ottomans could summon. Frankly, not since the days of Rome could one state logistically support so many far-flung endeavors simultaneously. Rhodes was the most dangerous remaining outpost in the eastern Mediterranean. It had given aid to the Venetians in their last war, raided Ottoman shipping, and was frankly just an anachronism from the Ottoman perspective in the late 15th century. I tend to agree with them. I mean, come on. A crusader state in the 1480s? The Crusades haven't been a thing for a long time. Time to give it up, guys. But the island was also valuable for strategic purposes. If he took Rhodes, then Mehmet would have a jumping-off point from which he might conquer Egypt. The Ottomans now felt confident in their naval ambitions. Taking Rhodes would not only prove that they were a naval power to contend with, but would also announce their arrival on the stage as a great naval power in the Mediterranean. The Knights, however, had long anticipated this and prepared their fortress island. They were not going to go easily. The Ottoman fleet was commanded by Mehmet Pasha, a former Byzantine. On May the 23rd, 1480, he arrived at Marmaris, directly across from Rhodes on the Anatolian coast. From there, he quickly ferried his 60,000-man army across to the island. Once arrived, they camped overlooking the town. After 2 quick but failed assaults, the Ottoman guns opened up on the town. But still, the defenders rejected Mehmet Pasha's peace offer. A third Ottoman assault on July the 28th failed, and the besiegers were compelled to retreat after taking heavy losses. By mid-August, 2 ships reached Rhodes bearing news that King Ferdinand of Naples was sending aid. This, plus the fact that the Pope had now promised to aid the last of the Holy Orders still doing anything, caused Mehmet Pasha to strike his banners and take his army back to Istanbul. For now, Rhodes remained in Christian hands. Ironically, at the exact same time that Ferrante's 2 ships sailed to Rhodes, an Ottoman force under Gehi Ahmed Pasha was sailing toward his kingdom. It hit the fortress at Otranto before it was ready, and the fortress fell in 2 days. When news reached the fractious Italian states, they panicked. For once, they put aside their endless differences and agreed to join together to meet this threat. Their concern was that the landing at Otranto was only the beginning of a larger and more concerted effort by the part of the Ottomans to take Italy. Now, whether this was Mehmet's intention or not remains the subject of some debate and speculation amongst historians. Some do believe that Mehmet's goal was to take Rome. Certainly, that would have fit with his personality as the Eastern Alexander or Caesar. A Caesar needs a Rome, after all. But if Rome was the goal, then the official court chronicler for Mehmet's reign never mentioned it. Moreover, at the very least, Mehmet did not follow up his victory at Otranto with an attempt to gain a foothold on the Italian mainland. The very next year, he marched east, not west. During the last days of April 1481, Sultan Mehmet crossed the Bosphorus and led his army through Anatolia. But on May the 3rd, 1481, while mustering his army, Mehmet died. He was 49 years old. His death was possibly due to complications from gout, but that's only one possibility. Mehmet had not yet designated a formal successor. Thus, there is a distinct possibility that one of Mehmet's sons had killed him before he could name a different son as his successor. Many Ottoman sultans had met and will meet their deaths over the years as the result of poison et al. It's not beyond the realm of possibility that Mehmet suffered a similar fate. Furthermore, during his reign, Mehmet had codified the practice of fratricide, quote, for the sake of the good order of the world. If any of his sons knew that he was not going to be the next sultan, that same son knew he was as good as dead. It was either strike now or die. I cannot say for certain, but for my part, I think Mehmet's death bears all the hallmarks of an assassination. Sultan Mehmet II had ruled the Ottoman Empire for 30 years. While terribly depopulated, Byzantine Constantinople was being remade as the flourishing capital of territories that included the Balkans, Black Sea, the Near East, and beyond. Constantinople got a new name, and the bone that had previously been in the throat of Allah became the administrative nerve center of an empire that could now threaten the heart of Europe. Rivals still existed east and west, but along the borders of Mehmet's empire there was little more than sporadic raiding to threaten his Ottoman peace. Obviously, at his death, Europe breathed a sigh of relief. It had been granted a reprieve, but only for a little bit. Once in possession of an imperial capital, the Ottomans developed a court ceremony to go with it. Trade up to Moscow flourished, allowing the sultans access to the rich ermine pelts to pad their robes, which would become a quintessential Ottoman image. The trade in slaves skyrocketed. Crimean Tartars now raided far north into Poland and Lithuania to get the human cargo their Ottoman masters demanded. Control over the commercial networks of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea allowed Mehmet to impose customs duties at a level unimaginable to previous sultans. One of his largest sources of income are called capitulations. You might recall I mentioned these earlier because Suleiman will grant Francis I several capitulations during their negotiations. So essentially, these are the right to trade and do business within the empire. Generally, they were exclusive, granted to one of the Italian states and interrupted in times of war. So by way of example, Mehmet granted capitulations to Venice immediately after the fall of Constantinople, while he went after the Genoese colonies in the Black Sea. But when Venice declared war in 1463, he ceased relations with Venice and granted capitulations to Genoa instead. Mehmet learned early on that he could use economics as a weapon. Now, importantly, the Ottomans always favored a command-style economy. All orders came from Istanbul, directing farmers what to farm, sponsoring the type of industry the Sultan wanted, etc., etc. The benefit of this system is that it allowed the Sultan to subordinate economic needs to social priorities. In this way, the Ottomans remained dominant in firearms throughout the balance of the 15th century because they subsidized and prioritized the production of artillery. But, of course, this system was not nearly as responsive as capitalism that favors not only profit, and that's going to develop in Europe very soon. In the short run, the Ottomans' command economy gave them an advantage, but in the long run, it would work to their detriment, as their economy will fail to keep pace with their Western counterparts. Of course, Mehmet had no way of knowing that at the time. The other problem was that the Ottoman economy was overwhelmingly dependent on agriculture. Even today, 40% of the population of the Turkish Republic is rural. Apart from Istanbul, the sultans made little to no effort to cultivate the creation of new cities. Now, taxes, by and large, were paid in cash. Sultans could also get income from war and expansion because, per Islamic law, they were entitled to 1/5 of the sale of any slave and the same amount of booty captured in war. Of course, as the empire expanded less and less, these sources of revenue dried up. But that was a problem for future sultans. For now, the Ottoman Empire maintained the strongest and most aggressive military machine in Europe. Of course, the flip side to all these benefits of expansion was the corresponding cost of expansion. Every time Mehmet annexed a new kingdom and made it into a province, he needed a government to run it and an army to garrison it. Both of these things cost money. So as I think you can imagine, any benefit in terms of booty or slaves taken was eaten up fairly quickly with the cost of maintaining the empire. In 1473, one source relates how at the time of Mehmet's victory over Hassan, there were 12,000 janissaries, the most expensive unit in the Ottoman army, and 7,500 cavalry alone. These troops were paid their salary every 3 months, as were the valued cannoneers and members of the vast transportation network. After all, a cannon doesn't do you very good if you can't get it out of Istanbul. By contrast, rural cavalry and garrison forces were not paid a salary. These troops were allowed to collect rents and taxes from the local peasantry. This is called the Timar system, and I'm going to get more into it in about 2 weeks. For now, just know it works a lot like European feudalism. Mehmet had a policy of confiscating land from local property owners and redistributing it in this system to cavalrymen. That was how he paid them. But I am only mentioning this because his successors are going to reverse the policy almost immediately. All of Mehmet's military campaigns plus his rebuilding efforts, Istanbul looked nothing like an imperial capital when he took it over. These were a heavy burden for his treasury to meet. As a result, he debased the coinage no less than 6 times. I guess I should mention here that, though, even by the time of Henry VIII in the mid-15th century, no one had any concept of what we would call economic policy, and I mean no one. The Ottomans were not alone in their ignorance. In many ways, economic thinking had not changed since the days of imperial Rome. Take what your neighbor has and make it yours. It is worth noting here one of the really novel aspects of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, like the Mamluks, enslaved Christians, turning young boys into future soldiers and bureaucrats. At its height, these slave ministers practically ran the empire, which is really unique. But it's all tied up in the idea that the Sultan wanted no one in power who was not 110% loyal to him. Certain areas, Istanbul and Bursa being the most notable, were exempt from these levies. But huge numbers of very important bureaucrats came from Albania, Greece, Bosnia, Bulgaria, Serbia, Croatia, and eventually Persia. It's interesting to me that the only people that the Sultan would trust to run the empire were the very peoples it had just conquered. But again, this has to do with loyalty, and we need to remember that at least in the 15th and 16th centuries, the Sultan led campaigns personally. While he was away, he needed someone he could trust in charge. And it couldn't be a male member of his family because, they were already dead. He had killed them all. So again, not less than a bit ironically, they turned to slaves. Mehmet then also started a new policy, whereby these new social climbers would be married into the royal family, connecting them to the Sultan even more. This pattern persisted until the end of the empire. The empire Sultan Mehmed set out to create was very different from the state his predecessors had won when it was merely the first among equals. His state was new and ambitious. He was willing to try new things, hence his efforts to recruit Christians into his bureaucracy and military. From the time of Mehmet onward, the Janissaries and other permanent members of the standing army became responsible for maintaining the empire. You might recall that when Mehmet moved to Constantinople to take the city, he summoned levies from across the Ottoman world. By the time of his death, that practice was largely antiquated. Local levies still assisted the professional army, but they were never its core. Now, the key group here is, of course, the Janissaries, the elite fighting force that is the exact center of the Ottoman military machine. Mehmet strove throughout his reign to keep an iron grip over the Janissaries. By and large, he succeeded. Some of his successors will not be so lucky. The Janissaries are kind of like the Praetorian Guard at the height of the Julio-Claudians. You really had to have them on your side. Mehmet's predecessors had worked to create the office of Sultan as the absolute ruler of the realm. Mehmet only increased this position. He saw himself as the heir to the Byzantine and hence Roman Empire. He identified himself as a new Caesar or Alexander. He read the classics and tried his best to emulate those models. A Byzantine chronicler wrote that Mehmet's exploits were equal to those of Alexander. Quote, "Seeing that you are the author of many great deeds, and in the belief that so many great achievements of generals and kings of old, nor merely Persians and Greeks, are not worthy to be compared in glory and bravery and martial value with yours, Mehmet, I do not think it just that they and their deeds and accomplishments should be celebrated and admired by all. While you should have no witness for the future, or the deeds of others, should be better known and more famed, while your accomplishments, which are in no way inferior to those of Alexander the Macedonian, should be set forth, not passed on to posterity." End quote. So desperate was the dead man to prove himself the classical torchbearer of times long gone by, that in 1462 Mehmet had even visited Troy. Next time. The death of Mehmet II gives Europe a short reprieve, but it does not take long for them to realize that under his son, things are going to get worse. If you're interested in more content, check out the links in the show notes. I have links there to the website, the Patreon page, which features ad-free versions of the show, early versions of the show, as well as bonus content. And if you're interested in the whole story again, but with better audio quality and much more detailed episodes, check out Western Civ 2.0. You can get a 7-day free trial. Link is in the show notes.